This is your reality check.
Welcome to The Reality Check, the weekly Canadian show that explores a wide range of controversies and curiosities using science and critical thinking. Today is May 23rd, 2021. I'm producer Pat, and with me is Cristina Roach.
Hey everyone!
We have three interesting segments for you this week. Adam looks into whether the internet is calling for Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs to be cancelled. Darren gives us another installment of good news from 2020. But first, Cristina, you're going to tell us about canine DNA testing.
I am. Our beloved dog Holden turned 13 this year. Or so we think he did, because when we got him from the SPCA in Elmer, Quebec, they told us he was 1.5 years old. They told us he's a mixed breed, part Border Collie, part Nova Scotia Duck Toller, and part awesome. I added that last part. The fact that he's showing signs that he's in his golden years has been weighing on me a little bit lately. I became curious about how one actually assesses a dog's age and how legit it is. According to the Humane Society in the US, the most reliable way is to look at a dog's teeth. But along with that search result followed dozens of others for doggie DNA tests that make claims in determining breeds, age, and potential health problems. I was intrigued, and that's what I'm going to chat about today. An example, DNAmydog.com says this about their test, which is listed for $99.99 US. The DNA My Dog Canine Genetic Age Test is designed to determine the biological age of your dog. Genetic or biological age is different than chronological or actual age, in that genetic age gives insight into the predicted longevity of your dog from a cellular level. Sounds pretty sciencey, huh? Now, canine DNA tests have become quite popular, in part because of the ease of ordering one to your front door now, and, in my opinion, also because of the great marketing. An Atlantic article relays a story about a company called Mars Pet Care, which launched its first canine DNA test in 2007. Now, at the time, if you were curious to find out your dog's breed mix, you had to go to the vet, since the test required drawing blood from your dog. The company also felt that vets could better interpret the results to pet owners. Now, when Mars figured out how to extract DNA from saliva, the direct-to-dog owner race began. The Atlantic article cites Embark, DNA My Dog, which I mentioned, and Paw Print Genetics as a handful of many companies that ship cheek swab kits directly to consumers, similar to companies like 23andMe, Pat.
Right.
Not gonna lie, as a dog owner, I can see the appeal of these kits. What about you?
I guess if you were really curious and that the results were somewhat reliable, I could see it.
Right. You make a good point there. If the results were somewhat reliable. Now, some of the tests claim to give owners risk estimates for more than 150 health conditions. And these owners are now bringing these test results to their vets who don't really know what to do with them. A writer, Sarah Zhang, says she reached out to the American Veterinary Medical Association, the American Animal Hospital Association, several state veterinarian associations to investigate their experience with DNA tests for her article. Most didn't reply, or replied saying DNA tests weren't on their radar. But other vets and canine geneticists who did respond to her were mostly skeptical. She speaks to Lisa Moses, a veterinarian and a researcher with Harvard Medical School Center for Bioethics. Moses says, veterinarians, we're not really educated in clinical genetics because it's a brand new field. Now, Moses recounts an incident that she also co-authored and published in Nature in 2018. This incident is actually what prompted her to more closely scrutinize the canine DNA test industry. The incident involved a 13-year-old dog whose ability to walk was deteriorating. The owners bought a DNA test, and this test uncovered a mutation which is linked to degenerative myelopathy, or DM for short, which is a neural disease. This led the owners to surmise that their dog would slowly die from this disease, so they put her down.
No.
Now, no disrespect to those owners. I'm sure they were doing what they thought was in their dog's best interest, so she wouldn't suffer.
And the dog was 13.
Yes.
Right.
But Pat, do you have any guess as to why this may be problematic?
Well, sure. Just because it may be predispositioned to something doesn't mean it's necessarily going to get it.
Exactly. Yeah. A professor of anatomy and genetics at Purdue University named Carrie Eckenstead advises that this mutation is really difficult to interpret. She calls it the ever-controversial DM mutation. Just because your dog may have the mutation doesn't mean the dog has or will get the disease. Now, in this case, Zhang points out it may have been a treatable spinal disorder. Moses stressed to NPR, I want pet owners and veterinarians to understand that they should not be using direct-to-consumer dog DNA testing to make medical decisions about individual animals. A blog from Irene Kelleher I came across cites the American Kennel Club as saying, the research is still in its infancy and warns about the, quote, unquantifiable level of worry, heartbreak, and sometimes false confidence these tests might stir. And when dog DNA companies can maintain secrecy, often under the veil of proprietary info, no one can really ascertain how accurate their results are. Add to that, the pet DNA industry is like the wild, wild west. While the FDA keeps an eye on companies like 23andMe, they don't monitor genetic testing for companion animals. So there are no regulations, no independent entities reviewing the methods or test result accuracy, no peer-reviewed publications, and that's a problem. As Moses tells NPR, it's hard to know how accurate they are. Different test companies use different methodologies as far as we know. Eleanor K. Carlson, a genetics researcher from the University of Massachusetts Medical School and the Broad Institute of MIT and Harvard, calls it a, quote, black box / trust what the company says situation. Now, in fairness, the bigger dog DNA companies conducting their own research are not fans of the lack of regulation either. They get that it's bad for their industry, and they fear a few bad apples can tarnish their reputation. Enter the harmonization of genetic testing for dogs, which is a genetic database that's trying to bring some standards and order to the industry in collaboration with some of the DNA testing companies. The database is a collection of dog genes linked to different diseases in different breeds, which is actually quite complicated, Pat, because I learned not all gene names are standardized, and breed names can be different between countries. Oh. To keep it short, the project is essentially amassing large genetic data sets, thanks to companies collecting DNA, that can be valuable to canine genetic research and complex disease research. So let me ask you this, Pat. I thought about this when I was researching, and some of these bigger dog DNA companies, like I said, they're not fans of lack of regulation. But at this point, if you're so confident in your research and you want it to be legit, wouldn't you want to open it up to peer review? Like, couldn't you just do that independently? Or do you think that's just a risk they're not willing to take right now?
You'd think that they'd be looking to standardize and prove that their results are good, but that the fact that they don't seem to necessarily be doing that makes me wonder again about the reliability of the results. And it sounds like it's a fairly new field.
Yes.
So, yeah.
Well, hopefully this harmonization of genetic testing for dogs project will help. Now, maybe you still want to find out about your dog's ancestry for fun. John Howe is the president of the American Veterinary Medical Association, and he told NPR's Patty Naiman, go for it. But understand that the results may not be accurate. And if you're doing it because you're worried about your dog's health, it really is best to talk to your vet instead. Says Howe, veterinarians are really adept at using all of our education, experiences, senses, and knowledge to diagnose and treat the patients that we have, as well as incorporating any external information from our clients or from literature or from other veterinarians. So there you go. Doggy DNA tests.
Makes me wonder, and I know that we've talked about maybe doing this on the show at some point, but like how accurate something like 23andMe is.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Well, with that, we'll turn things over to Darren and Adam. I hope everyone out there is staying safe and healthy, and we will talk to you soon.
Stay classy, not smart-assy, and stay safe, everyone.
Hello, listeners. This is my third segment on the theme of good news in 2020. Like I said before, the year 2020 seems to be the dumpster fire that keeps on giving, but that doesn't mean that nothing good happened all last year. The news slants one way with bad stories, and the brain suffers from availability bias. We tend to think things are all bad, but this false belief can make us less likely to make things better. Just like the previous one on global health, this segment will discuss some of the good news that happened in 2020 with a focus on peace, safety, and human rights. Once again, my main source is an article by FutureCrunch, available in the show notes at trcpodcast.com.
Great website.
Let's begin. In 2020, the Global Terrorism Index found that the deaths from terrorism fell for the 5th consecutive year since peaking in 2014. This index is released by the Institute for Economics and Peace, and I'm using coverage from Vision of Humanity's website. Here are some of the highlights, and I'm basically quoting. The number of deaths has now decreased by 59% since 2014 to 13,826, precise. The largest decreases in deaths occurred in Afghanistan and Nigeria. However, they are still the only two countries to have experienced more than 1,000 deaths from terrorism, indicating that's pretty distributed. The fall in deaths from terrorism was also reflected in country scores, with 103 improving compared to 35 that deteriorated. This is the highest number of countries to record a year-on-year improvement since the inception of the index. Great. Read a headline, terrorism, things are bad. Like, oh, well, actually, it's getting better in most places.
Yeah. Doesn't mean there isn't more work to do, but it's encouraging and means we can work on what works.
Exactly. That reminds me of that wonderful line by Max Roser, the 3 things that everyone should agree to before a conversation. The world is amazing, the world is awful, and things can get better. Or things are getting better. It's something like that. Like, okay, because usually when you say one of those things, people don't think you believe the other thing.
Yes.
It's like, oh yeah, things are awful, and they're getting better. Oh.
Yes.
In 2020, the Falkland Islands announced that it's free of landmines. Didn't even know they had them, but great, now they're free.
Yeah.
Britain and Argentina fought a war 40 years ago, and they left lots of landmines behind. For over 10 years, tens of thousands of explosive devices have been removed by specialists, some of them from Zimbabwe even. Many thought this would never happen. It's terrible to have landmines left behind, but amazing to have them removed.
Oh, yeah.
Once I think, imagine this was in your country. How many landmines would you need to make you more cautious walking outside in certain fields?
Well, you just wouldn't venture to somewhere that isn't regularly traveled. Like,
exactly.
You would just be
You would literally stay on the path.
Yeah.
At all times.
Yeah.
Next, over the past 5-6 years, Germany stepped up on the world stage and opened its borders to over 1 million refugees. Merkel said famously, "We will manage this." She was criticized, and many predicted failure and great harm to Germany. Happily, it's been largely a success story.
Good.
A quote from The Guardian, "More than half of those who came in are in work and pay taxes. Among refugee children and teenagers, more than 80% say they have a strong sense of belonging to their German schools and feel liked by their peers."
Wow.
Great. Is it perfect? No, again, nothing is. Sure. Do some people think this was a huge mistake? Of course they do. But this is pretty impressive and pretty amazing. Importantly, there's also been progress in the terrible thing that is child marriage, which is akin to slavery in some instances. In 2020, both Palestine and Saudi Arabia banned it. Additionally, while Bangladesh still has a huge problem with child marriage, they've made progress with 10 million fewer girls being married over the past decade.
So how do they define it? 18 and under, 16 and under?
It's usually 18.
Okay.
Some places 16.
Sure.
I mean, even in the States, quite frankly, learning the age of consent is 16 in some states and 18 in others,
Sure.
like Florida. Some quick hits of good news, quoting Future Crunch. Iran approved a measure to criminalize child abuse and neglect. There's a concept.
Sure.
Saudi Arabia abolished the practice of flogging convicts and banned the death sentence for minors. Another good idea. Okay. And the United Arab Emirates overhauled some of its strictest Islamic laws, including the criminalization of honor killings, tougher penalties for sexual harassment, and the decriminalization of suicide and attempted suicide. As well, Pakistan approved a new anti-rape law, prohibiting the disclosure of the identity of rape victims, creating a national sex offenders register, abolishing antiquated two-finger testing, as terrible as it sounds, where someone literally tests whether your hymen is intact by inserting their fingers in you, and setting up special courts for rape cases. And in Sierra Leone, a 5-year-old ban preventing pregnant teenagers from attending school was reversed. It's like, well, okay. So this is, when you hear about these things, you're like, that's terrible that existed in the first place, which is not the good news story I want to tell. But yes, It gives you a sense of what else is going on in different parts of the world, and things are better, at least in those places at these times. On the other side of the world, to assist those with fewer resources to deal with menstruation, in 2020, New Zealand started providing free sanitary products in schools across the country. Okay. Scotland heard this and said, "Hold my kilt," because a few months later, they introduced free universal access to period products, as they call them, making their provision in public buildings a legal right. Scotland was the first country in the world to do this.
So basically anyone of any age can walk into a public building and have access to napkins, tampons, whatever.
Yes, I assume in the bathrooms.
Oh, okay, sure.
Not in the foyer.
Why?
But yes, maybe. I assume it has to be made available somewhere.
Okay. Yeah, yes. I guess women's bathrooms have different kind of machines than men's bathrooms have. We have gum and condoms, and women have tampons. And,
perhaps, yes, exactly. In September of 2020, the FBI released a report saying that violent crime in the United States has decreased for the third year in a row. Property crime was down again too. Of course, a 2020 report usually only goes up to 2019, but the press release said, quote, while the downward trends over the past 3 years are encouraging, the department remains steadfast in its efforts. On September 15th, 2020, the FBI published its preliminary uniform crime report, January to June 2020, which revealed overall declines in the number of violent crimes and property crimes reported for the first 6 months of 2020 when compared with the figures for the first 6 months of 2019. While there were significant decreases in the number of rapes and robberies, there was a significant spike in murders and an increase in aggravated assaults. Bit of a mixed bag. My point was just that things are overall down, and they were even down in the first part of 2020.
Yes. I think 2020 is a unique year in a lot of ways. I think property damage is going to be a bit of an outlier for the later half.
Yes. So I was saying that to share how brains are affected by availability bias, when I think about property crime in 2020, I think of all the protests and the images I saw in the news.
Right. So I'm thinking property damage, which may not be the same
well,
idea here.
Perhaps, though. I'm not sure. The images I don't have come to mind is the absence of crime because people were stuck at home during COVID.
Absolutely.
That said, more businesses might have been broken into because fewer people around to guard them. It's hard to know how intuitions work here. That's why data is very useful.
Yeah.
Relatedly, the U.S. imprisonment rate is at its lowest level in more than 2 decades. The greatest decline has come among Black Americans, whose imprisonment rate has decreased 34% since 2006.
Is it decriminalization of certain kinds of law offenses, or is it a different policing? Or
I'm not entirely sure.
Reduction of poverty?
So these are great questions. I think it's obviously going to be a combination of things. We don't want to make the single cause fallacy. That I thought that could be its own segment in the future. Right?
Yeah, for sure.
And what about any good news in the domain of LGBTQIA+. Well, in May 2020, Costa Rica legalized same-sex marriage. Then in June 2020, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that employers who fire workers for being gay or transgender are breaking the country's civil rights laws. In a 6-3 decision, the Supreme Court said federal law, which prohibits discrimination based on sex, should be understood to include sexual orientation and gender identity.
So it's sort of a interpretation of the existing.
Expanding, what that word might mean.
Yeah.
Still, in June 2020, homosexuality was decriminalized by lawmakers in Gabon. Then, in July 2020, the small country of Montenegro became the first country in the Balkans to allow same-sex civil unions. In October, in Taiwan, 2 same-sex couples took part in a mass wedding hosted by the military. This is the first time this has happened. And a couple days later, over 130,000 people came out for their Pride Parade in Taipei.
Cool.
Finally, in December 2020, quoting Future Crunch, Bhutan became the second Asian country after Taiwan to legalize same-sex relationships, and in Nepal, authorities said that they would count LGBTQIA+ people for the first time in their national census to help sexual minorities gain better access to education and health schemes. What wonderful news in 2020.
Yeah. I mean, these kind of things remind us that there's still a lot to do because, these are things that have been legal here, maybe for not that long. In Canada, same-sex marriage hasn't been legal for that long, but it's always good and encouraging to hear that progress continues to march forward. I don't think a lot of countries have criminalized same-sex marriage in the past year, right?
Correct. As far as I know, yes. And it is, as Adam said, it highlights how lucky many people are to live in the places they live, like us in Canada. And it shows we should think more about what our basis for comparison is. Always striving to do better. And yes, why not have a higher standard for the entire earth? But recognizing where some countries are and recognizing progress where it occurs is very important.
Yeah, and that's always tricky, right? You can't tell someone to do something. You want sort of people to figure out for themselves, but you also don't want people to be oppressed. So it's difficult, right? Mm-hmm. But it's encouraging that things are improving. What's up, cuboids? Is Snow White being cancelled? The appropriateness of the prince kissing a sleeping Snow White has been making headlines lately. I recall when this came up many years ago, as I wrote about the topic for my Sailor Moon website at the time, this seemed like a good time to cover the issue, all while lazily reusing some of that content. Much like Disney did when they reused animation from Snow White and other Disney films in later movies. So first off, what exactly is going on, and is anyone really trying to cancel Snow White? The first article I saw was titled, "Disney Fans Worried as the Internet Tries to Cancel Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs." Well, That's a bold statement. Is the internet trying to cancel Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, the 1937 Disney animated film based on the 1812 Brothers Grimm fairy tale? To get to the bottom of this, I did this simple TRC investigative trick, which is to keep clicking on the source of an article until I get to the original source. Sometimes it takes quite a few clicks. So I clicked from WeGotThisCovered.com to The Blaze, to the New York Post, to SFGate, that being San Francisco. Only 3 click-throughs. I've seen much worse. I've seen better, obviously. So, is the internet really trying to cancel Snow White? The article in question is written by 2 reporters from San Francisco. Now, let's not pretend that California, or San Francisco for that matter, is representative of the internet as a whole. The article is not about the movie, but a revamped version of a Snow White ride at Disneyland. So that's the one in California, not the one in Florida. The issue they have is with the grand finale of the ride, in which the prince finds Snow White asleep, he thinks she's dead, and gives her a true love's kiss to release her from the enchantment. In the article's words, quote, "A kiss he gives her without her consent while she's asleep, which cannot possibly be true love if only one person knows it's happening." So, this logic is a bit convoluted. Okay, so right off, let's just get the first question out of the way. In 2021, it does not seem that the internet is trying to cancel Snow White. There are 2 ladies in San Francisco who don't like one scene in the ride that is inspired by the film. Another quote from the article, "Haven't we already agreed that consent in early Disney movies is a major issue?" Can I answer this question? No, we haven't already agreed on that, given the reaction many have to this particular think piece. Surely some people think that, such as the authors here. How many is hard to quantify, but there are certainly some outside of the article that also feel that way. But the internet as a whole, given how much this coverage is basically talking about how people are annoyed at the suggestion that it's inappropriate, means that the internet is not trying to cancel Snow White. The internet is not some single unified voice. So, let's go back to the original question then. Is it an inappropriate kiss? Now, I've seen the Snow White film a few times, but I haven't seen this ride. As it's described in the article, the prince kisses a sleeping Snow White in order to release her from the enchantment. Now, I don't know if this much is specified, but if it is, let's not be silly about what's occurring here. If the prince intends to save Snow White from an eternal sleep, then what he's doing is not some sort of sexual assault, but a life-saving intervention. Consider, for example, an EMT who might have to tear an unconscious person's clothes off to heal a wound or provide some other kind of life-saving intervention. This is completely justified both legally and morally. The circumstance is important, and most people would defend this, but not similarly defend someone removing an unconscious or sleeping person's clothes in order to see them naked if it was motivated by lust. Intent matters, despite what some people may claim. It's legally and morally important. It's why you don't use the same legal recourse on someone who accidentally injures someone in a car accident as opposed to someone who intentionally hits someone with a car. All that said, that's not really how the movie plays out. There's more context to consider here. Snow White and the Prince are not strangers. They interact briefly at the start of the film before the evil queen splits them up. The narrative of the film suggests that there is an attraction there, but there is no implied relationship which exists prior to the kiss that is exchanged. Later in the film, when Snow White is under a spell from the evil queen's poison apple, she is presumed to be dead by the 7 dwarves as well as the prince. The prince does not think he is kissing a sleeping woman, and he also does not have any reason to believe that his true love's kiss will actually resurrect her. He loves her, and so he kisses her. Does this matter? To say it plainly, it is not appropriate to kiss a sleeping person that you have no existing relationship with. That's sort of basic consent. If 2 people are in a relationship and one is sleeping, it actually wouldn't be that inappropriate to kiss them. I've kissed sleeping spouses before. If I'm coming to bed or getting up or whatever, I kiss my sleeping children all the time. It isn't some violation of consent when this action is consistent with sort of established activities, and there's no refusal that happens. So the Snow White situation in the context of the film is not something the audience tends to reject. It's an exchange between 2 characters who are considered to be romantically linked, though the fact that they aren't really in a relationship during this scene does mean that the prince has no reason to assume consent from a sleeping Snow White. Also, he thinks she's dead, which I wouldn't say is better, it's just different. So it's just maybe a little weird too. Also worth considering is that it's Snow White's story. It's not the prince's story. So the audience isn't expected to view the situation through his eyes. It's romantic from Snow White's point of view because she loves the prince and this is something that she wants. From the prince's point of view, it is actually an inappropriate thing for him to do. That's not generally how people view the film. So should the movie be canceled for this? Well, I don't think that's actually what the article or anyone has even been suggesting. They simply thought it was inappropriate to include this in the ride. Since it is the most iconic scene in the film, it seems like a no-brainer to include it in the ride. I don't know why someone would be surprised by this. As for Disney doing anything about it, I don't see any sign of that yet. Some have pointed to Disney putting warnings in front of certain of classic movies as a precedent here. So movies like Dumbo, Peter Pan, and the Aristocats have a disclaimer put before them on Disney Plus warning of dated or potentially offensive scenes. So personally, I think this is the way to go. When an alternative is not including the film or removing scenes in question, a disclaimer means people are still able to enjoy them while simply being asked to consider the cultural context of the film, which is always important when you're watching something that's decades old or even close to a century old, as is the case with Snow White. Now, one issue is that on Disney Plus, a kid's account can't watch a movie that has a disclaimer in the front of it. So a kid's account can't watch a G-rated film like Dumbo or Peter Pan. This seems silly? Sure, but that's not a terribly uncommon problem. I used to have a kid's account for my own kids, but I had to upgrade my 4-year-old daughter's account to a teen account so that she could watch films like Moana, Wreck-It Ralph, or The Incredibles. These are all PG-13. Meanwhile, other PG-13 films work fine on a kid's account, such as Frozen and the Tangled films. So now if my son wants to watch a movie, if he wants to watch Moana, I've got to go on my daughter's account because I can't watch Moana on his kid's account. So this is annoying as well because when I log into my 4-year-old's Disney Plus account, it asks if I want to watch Star Wars, Marvel, National Geographic content instead of Mickey Mouse, princesses, Disney Junior, the kind of things that are more child appropriate, the kind of things that I would want her to see. Ultimately, we need to ask ourselves whether a portrayal of some action in a movie or show is likely to cause some negative real-world behavior. In general, the link between things like violence in games and movies and violence in real life has not been demonstrated. Does that mean that other representation in movies doesn't matter? Well, it seems plausible that seeing something on screen could lead a person to think it is more or less acceptable depending on how it's portrayed, but this isn't clearly established and it isn't clear how strong this influence could be. So in some cases, it might in some minor way cause some influence, and in others, it might not. That said, we need to understand the context here. In the fantasy setting of a film, the action may not be something which will be emulated by an audience. A person is not likely to find the perfectly preserved body of a person they fell in love with years earlier in the woods. Vigilantes are commonly portrayed as being good in films, but this doesn't seem to encourage actual acts of vigilante behavior in the real world. Some vigilantes do exist. They don't seem to have anything in common with Batman. They usually fight immigrants and drug dealers and things like that. There are often magical or otherwise unbelievable, unrealistic elements in a film which are part of the motivations of a scene, like the magical spell cast on Snow White, which is the reason for which the prince kisses her, even if he doesn't really know that. That's the point in the movie. So would a person watching a movie like Snow White be more likely to kiss an unwilling sleeping person or otherwise have a greater difficulty understanding the concept of consent? I tend to think no. But there is this sort of hyper-focus on certain things being portrayed in the media, even if that relation to the real world isn't clearly demonstrated. So when I was young, it was common for pearl-clutching Puritan religious fundamentalists to be against certain things in media, music, TV, movies, games, whatever. So these days, the Puritans are often from the opposite end of the political horseshoe. The political spectrum. Now, one thing I would ask you to consider is whether you think something like this particular scene or other portrayals in media influence your views rather than whether or not they influence the views of others. It seemed obvious to me that I didn't expect media to influence me much, which is why I generally always expected this to be true for other people as well. But obviously, other people don't really feel that way. While preparing this segment, I happened to learn about a very relevant phenomenon called the third-person effect, in which people assume that mass media messages have a greater effect on others rather than themselves. So this is a bias, but two possible reasons for this are that a person is more influenced by media than they expect, or that others are less influenced by media than they would expect. I think it might actually be a combination of both. So, rather than focusing on others, ask yourself if you think rock music has made you worship the devil, that the Power Rangers caused you to be more violent, that porn makes you disrespect women, that Grand Theft Auto makes you have an unrealistic expectation about coming in and getting coffee, or that various portrayals of marginalized people have made you racist, sexist, homophobic, and all those other bad things. And of course, do you think that kissing a non-consenting sleeping person is more acceptable because you watched the movie Snow White as a child? If you don't, then why do you think you're better than everyone else? So when the Snow White topic came up in 2018, it was actress Kristen Bell who brought it up. Now, her views on this were pretty straightforward. She didn't have any issue with her kids reading fairy tales or watching certain movies, but she had a conversation with them about the media that they were consuming. In this case, whether or not it's okay to kiss a sleeping person. Now, this seems to be a completely reasonable thing to do, and something a responsible parent would benefit from doing with their child, as this is, of course, nothing like writing an op-ed asking them to remove the most iconic scene from a movie from a ride that is based on it. Is Snow White being cancelled? Hardly. A few loud people have a problem with the prince's non-consensual kiss in the film, but this does not currently seem to be a particular mainstream view, and the general public appear to be largely rejecting this idea. While it would not surprise me to see this idea get more attention in the future, as many much more idiotic things have gotten a lot of traction, in 2018 this does not appear to be the case. Ultimately, I think most reasonable people would consider kissing a sleeping person to be inappropriate or even a form of sexual assault. It seems fairly implausible that viewing Snow White is likely to encourage any of these people to believe that this behavior is okay, simply because something that was somewhat similar happened in the film. Peace out, cuboids.
For show notes or to discuss this episode, visit our Facebook page and website at trcpodcast.com. For general inquiries or to send a topic or parody suggestion, email info@trcpodcast.com. Help support the show by leaving a review on iTunes and liking us on Facebook. Follow us on Twitter at @TRC_podcast.